And it would take me an hour to go through and read all of the accolades for Dr. Aravich. I've known him for quite some time, but I haven't seen him for a while, so it's a real pleasure that he's here with us today. And he's going to talk about Alzheimer's and brains and impact on the brains, and many of you have had a chance to visit his table. If you haven't, make sure after his talk that you get a moment to do that. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Aravich. We're so glad that you're here today.
Thank you, Ellen, and I think the doctor stuff gets in the way. That's why it's crossed out on my tag. So I'm Paul. I'm very pleased to have worked with Ellen and others in the Central Western Virginia chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, and also very pleased to work with Kathy, wherever you are, Kathy, partly how I'm here. She's an ombudsman, and man, some of the boots on the ground, as you professional caregivers know, are the ones trying to do the right thing by making sure our nursing homes are doing the right thing. And like so many persons who do priceless stuff, ombudsmen are underpaid and underserved. But that's the way it is. Thank you, Kathy. Just coincidentally, she put me up in the Fawn Inn last night, and I got in late. I had a rough day, and had a whirlpool bath in this thing. Oh, it was so cool, and so I particularly was thankful about that.
Don't take those things.
All right, so I'm going to talk about this screen that is painful, not just for persons who have the dementias, but also the caregivers. And not just the caregivers and the care recipients, but the economy and the culture of America, and not just the U.S., but globally. And so when we do global medicine, we talk so often about maternal fetal health and infectious diseases, but the newest version of global health interventions now is emphasizing chronic diseases in the developing world, not least of which would be Alzheimer's disease and neurological disorders and psychiatric disorders. All right, so I'm going to take you on a ride, and I think that you described yourself to me earlier today as having a lot of energy. I too have that, and that's a curse and it's a blessing. Yeah. So we'll have to go. It cuts both ways. Here's a mission moment, and I just want to ask you what you see. And what you see, depending upon how biased you are, is a morbidly obese guy, or if you look for the person behind that phenotype and learn more about him, you would see, by all accounts, a wonderful person, a nice, kind-hearted guy who can sing with a ukulele like nobody else. And there's the hot link there. And so what I'm challenging you to do from a mission moment point of view is, do you look for greatness in the persons you're taking care of? Yeah. And very importantly, if not more importantly, do you look for greatness in yourself? Because it's very easy to coulda, woulda, shoulda, doubt yourself. You got to look for greatness in yourself as well as those that are around you. And Over the Rainbow is what this guy is famous for singing, and somewhere over the rainbow, certainly bluebirds will fly. All right, now, the world's largest minority on Earth, according to the United Nations, is persons with chronic disabilities. Number one most prevalent is neuropsychiatric, and among those, the number one most prevalent disability is psychiatric, and the number two most prevalent disability is neurological. So the kinds of stuff we're talking about today reflect the largest minority group on Earth by way of the largest subsection of that group. All right, now let's get into successful aging as related to the dementias here. Now, when I go to Capitol Hill, do many different things with congressional caucus programs and stuff, I always talk about the brain as the universe between our ears. When I gave one of the very first ever NASA TEDx talks, I told NASA that rocket science is for wimps, the real action is neuroscience, how they put 12 people on the moon with their brains, and what is the last frontier of science, behavioral neuroscience? What do we mean by depression? What do we mean by Alzheimer's disease? What do we mean by schizophrenia? schizophrenia. The brain on the top and the brain on the bottom are both over on the table there. One on the top had the clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and the one below it is a fatal traumatic brain injury. Most common cause is falls. Falls are a geriatric giant, and persons with the dementias are prone to falls, and so they're not unrelated. But when I give talks to brain injury groups versus dementia groups, totally different silos, and it turns out that traumatic brain injury is argued to be the #1 most important risk factor environmentally for all forms of dementia, Alzheimer's, frontotemporal, all the various forms of dementia, and yet the two tend not to meet. I'm going to comment more about silos and how they impede progress rather than facilitate progress. Coincidentally, I was looking last night for the Great Square of Pegasus, from which is off one of the tails is a slight glimmer of light, which is actually the Andromeda Galaxy, way bigger than the Milky Way galaxy. And you can see that with the unaided eye on a night where it's not light polluted. That light that tickles your retina left that galaxy almost 2.5 million years ago. Who says you can't look back into the past? You're literally looking back into the past. And it's 15 billion miles that you can see with the unaided eye. We call that a miracle. The retina, the neuroretina is part of the central nervous system. It grew out of the brain embryologically. And if the retina is miraculous, can you imagine the ability of what our human brains can achieve, even with dementia? Now, successful aging is a creature for all creatures, great and small, to quote the book. Whether you're this lowly mayfly that people who fish for trout love to use and catch the rainbow trout and stuff like that, they live one day, or the majestic, I shouldn't say majestic, the scrawny, bristlecone pine tree that lives as long as the pyramids have been here. That is to say, the bristlecone pine tree makes the giant sequoias and the California redwoods literally babes in the woods compared to them, but they're scrawny. And in the West, of course, big is better. So we know about the sequoias and stuff. We don't know so much about the bristlecone pine tree. Living where lots of other things won't live for millennia. Pretty remarkable thing. Persons who have disabilities need to have what they have promoted, and people who don't have disabilities need to have successful aging promoted. It's for all creatures, great and small. It's a brain thing. Successful aging is a brain thing. Successful aging is not a healthy person sitting in a rocking chair watching Gilligan Island reruns all day long. That's not successful aging. Successful aging is a person who's engaged in the world around him or her, like virtually everyone in this room is trying to do. High social, interactive kinds of functions, cognitive functions, and physical functions. It's way more than just being physically healthy to have successfully aged. Now, this is a person that I've been showing my med students for a long time. We were the caregivers for a person with an intellectual disability, Ann Helen. And when her caregiver died, nobody in the family wanted Ann Helen with her intellectual disability at the age of 65. So we took Ann Helen. She lived with us until she died. She had an intellectual disability, but she loved the National Geographic. And so one of the high spots of the week was when the National Geographic came by, and we would sit and look at pictures. And when I saw this picture in the National Geographic of a person named Faye Wells, I said, my God, that is the face of successful aging. And I've been showing it to my med students ever since. One time, one of the medical students says, I know that woman, she's my friend's grandmother, she lives in Northern Virginia, here's her email. And so we were making plans for Faye Wells to come down and model successful aging at the Eastern Virginia Medical School. Sadly, 2 weeks after my last email to her, she died and she never was able to come down. But that last email asked, what is the key to successful aging? And to paraphrase what she said, pursue the unexpected opportunities in life. She unexpectedly flew airplanes with Amelia Earhart. Unexpectedly was the White House correspondent for the New York Tribune. She said everything meaningful to her came completely unexpectedly. And I think there's a wonderful wisdom to her. And I just want to show her face to you. I mean, check out those beads. Are they not really cool? I mean, this is one sorry, I hate to date myself as a baby boomer, but back in the day we would say she's she's the bomb. Now I'm involved with the suicide program, and we had Run DMZ. Sorry, I'm not a rapper
DMZ,
person.
yeah.
Is that, I get that right? The guy who's one of the honchos with that gave us a talk. He tried to die by suicide and failed, and I talked to him afterwards, and I said, because I didn't want to date myself as a baby boomer and say you were the bomb, I said you were the dope. And he quickly corrected me and said, no, you don't say the dope, you just say dope. And so I learned that you don't try to be cool if you're not cool, is what I learned. Now, I think the new kids would not say she's the bomb or not she's dope. I think they say lit. I think they would say she's lit. I don't know. It's kind of hard to get past these generations. Now, here's Watson, a Watson and Crick fame, the persons who discovered DNA. I heard him on PBS say him and Crick discovered the secret of life. I don't think so. I think Faye Wells discovered the secret of life. Coincidentally, I did a presentation at the Salk Institute where Crick was still active well into his late 80s, and his assistant said, I see you bring brains here and everywhere. Can't you get a brain for Dr. Crick? And I said, you're talking about the most famous person on earth can't get his hands on a brain as far as scientific investigation stuff is concerned. He can't because he's just not like me at a medical school, and so he used to use these plastic things. And there's nothing like the real brain, and again, you can check that out if you want. Coincidentally, too, I did a workshop with his granddaughter, and she told me his house was full of the arts. I'll talk more about the arts in a moment, but you want to exercise your brain? Nothing like arts. That's what the Lego stuff is. It's a creative effort. That's what the arts are all about. I'll have more to say about that. Now, we're going to talk about, do we fear aging? Is it something deadly that we should fear? No, getting older is not something to fear. What we fear is this programmed deterioration of function that is otherwise known as senescence. If you want to fear a particular part of your aging process, think about being a teenager. Oh my God, that is scary. How we ever survived being a teenager is totally beyond me. So aging is not a disease, but when we start losing the capacity to defend against different visigoths that are attacking us, then it is problematic. We fear senescence. We don't fear aging, despite the fact that Silicon Valley is trying to get a cure for aging. Many of us in the geriatrics world take very strong exception, because if you're trying to cure it, you're saying it's a disease, and we don't think that it is. But here is the Visigoths. Remember, Attila the Hun was more afraid of the Visigoths than he was some of his compatriots. So we have these Visigoths attacking our body all the time by way of things called oxidative stress, inflammatory cytokine, different kinds of attackers heading after our body. But we need a protective moat, like around a castle, protective moat, to defend against these Visigoths. And what successful aging and the protection against senescence is all about is strengthening that moat, maintaining that moat. And how do you strengthen this moat that is protecting against the Visigoths? Healthy lifestyle, God forbid, good nutrition, exercise, nothing high-tech. Pretty positive kinds of things rather than the high-tech stuff. So we need to promote successful aging, and doing that by way of many different manipulations is by way of promoting what we call brain fitness. Now, it is a fact that our cognitive short-term memory declines as a function of age. It peaks around the age of 20. So my 20-year-old med students, when they have to binge purge like bulimics on a short-term memory exam with 100,000 facts, are going to do better on that short-term memory task than, the medical students that I teach who are former Navy SEALs and 40 years old and so on. And so basically, that 40-year-old Navy SEAL is at a disadvantage just by simple virtue of the fact short-term memory peaks at around the age of 20. Okay, so if you guys want somebody to remember something for 10 minutes, get a young person, all right? Now, let's talk about mild cognitive impairment. It is not a short-term memory problem. It is something that is beyond age-related memory decline. It is a precursor, in many instances, to the dementias, particularly Alzheimer's disease. So we do have reductions in short-term memory as a function of age. That's age-related memory loss. But we don't want to confuse that with mild cognitive impairment, which is a stepping stone to dementia itself. All right, now let's go into the markers for example, Alzheimer's disease. Ever since Dr. Alzheimer's coined the term Alzheimer's disease, we've been focusing on these things called plaques and tangles. Can only see them microscopically, and they are needed for the final definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. The amyloid plaques are sometimes called beta amyloid plaques, and the predominant theory in Alzheimer's disease for a very long time is related to Baptists, not the people who come in this building here, but beta amyloid protein devotees. They're like a mafia to some of us. If it's not all about amyloid beta, then it ain't what it's supposed to be. And then there's some people that think the tau, the yellow stuff, the tangles that are related to clogs in the railroad tracks that are in the cell are the key to understanding Alzheimer's disease, and we would call them Taoists. So you got the Baptist point of view, you got the Taoist point of view, but then there are these crazy people called others who believe it's not so simple, and there are multiple factors contributing and adding and synergizing together, but those are your plaques and tangles. I should mention, we all have plaques and tangles as we get older, all of us. It's a normal feature of aging. It's an excess number of plaques and tangles that is used to define Alzheimer's disease, and what happens is there are countless demonstrations of people with tons and tons of black plaques and tangles in their brain with no cognitive impairment at all. So if you do the math, it doesn't add up at all with the plaques and tangles, and many of us are not supporting the Baptist point of view or the Taoist point of view as much as used to be the case. Now, let's do all-cause dementia. What is dementia? It has to impair your daily activities. So if you're forgetting where you put your glasses or your coffee cup, that's not dementia. We like to say if you forget where you parked your car, that is not a problem. If you forget that you parked your car, now that's more of a problem. I always lose my car. I go to a mall. Every time I go to a mall, I lose my car because I don't pay attention to it. I got to get, the balloons for my son's birthday party or something. I don't pay attention to where I parked the car. That's less important to me. And then, of course, when I'm trying to find it after I get the balloons. So we have to have a cognitive impairment that is impairing our daily activities in one of these 5 different cognitive domains. In fact, we need multiple cognitive domains that are impacted negatively for the diagnosis of dementia. Memory is only one of several. Language problems. We can talk about judgment and reasoning. You put the iron in the refrigerator. That's a judgment kind of an issue. Visual spatial function. It's tested with a clock, an analog clock. I'm not sure that the millennials and these other people know what we're talking about when we talk about a clock, because of course everything is digitized for those people, but we don't want to get into millennials. That would take us 40 days and 40 nights, so we won't. But functionally speaking, this is driving your car. And one of the major issues in rural areas or less urban areas is you take the driver's license away from somebody, man, you're robbing them of their independence big time. And we can talk about issues that relate to personnel and behavioral changes. So for the general diagnosis of all-cause dementia, at least 2 of those 5 domains have to be eroded on standardized tests. The impairments have to progressively decline. So Anne Helen, with her intellectual disability, she had impaired cognitive function, but it was steady the whole time. She didn't show any decline, and so that was not dementia. That was an intellectual disability that she had. And it can't be due to delirium and some of these other factors that relate to depression. I'll reiterate this point in a moment. You can mess up cognition, not just with dementia, but with depression and fluctuations in cognition known as delirium. The 3 Ds. And boy, you need an expert to render this diagnosis. I taught 4,000 medical students in my day. They're not all created equal, particularly within the subspecialties of doing dementia assessments. So, and you got to rule out other things. You want to mess up all functions in your body, mess up the thyroid gland. So the process of exclusion, process of inclusion. Now, this is the diagnosis of probable Alzheimer's disease. Needs confirmation, either the post-mortem confirmation of the plaques and tangles, or needs confirmation by fancy imaging known as PET imaging to show an excess number of plaques and tangles. So you got to meet the general criteria for all-cause dementia with the following stipulations. You have to not only show the gradual onset and slow progression, but at least 3 specific domains plus another one have to be deficient. So remember, there's 5 cognitive domains. And so 4 out of the 5 cognitive domains for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease must be shown to be deficient. If it's less than that, then it's not going to be Alzheimer's disease. And one of them is memory loss. The other one is the visual spatial stuff and the judgment and reasoning, and then either a language problem or personality problem. All right, the 3 Ds. Experts. You need somebody who's not just a neurologist, not just a geriatrician, or not just a neuropsychologist. You need an expert in the diagnosis of the dementias to render the diagnosis properly. And make sure you don't have the other 2 Ds messing it up by way of impaired cognition and or by way of fluctuations in cognitive status known as delirium. When my medical students are not doing well, I never assume they're not studying. These people we bring into our med schools are OCD when it comes to getting perfect grades and binge purging short-term memory. Never the fact that they aren't studying. Almost always the cognitive impairment that I see is due to an underlying depression or psychosocial issues that have not been addressed properly. So you want to mess up cognition, you have depression, as we heard a little about earlier today. Now, there are reversible types. And so you want to make sure you get the right diagnosis, because if it's irreversible, that's one thing. But hey, if it's reversible, that's another thing. And one of the number one cause of a reversible dementia is polypharmacy. You can hate the Affordable Care Act, you can love the Affordable Care Act, but the fact that we have an annual wellness visit is designed in part to make sure these conflicting medications that you're on are not present and have to be reduced. And so the number one form of reversible dementia is too many drugs, with the cardiologist not doing what the pulmonologist is doing, not knowing what the nephrologist is doing. Malnutrition, you want to mess somebody up, you just don't feed them. You don't have to be in Auschwitz to be malnourished. There are a lot of people here in the United States who are suffering from food insufficiency and different nutrient kinds of problems related sometimes, for example, to gastric bypass surgery. There's a number of different ways to have essential compounds not being put into you that can be corrected because they are reversible. And then I just mentioned, among others, thyroid problems. Always have the thyroid status checked out before any kind of dementia of the irreversible type is present. Okay, now let's look at all-cause dementia. There's all kinds, and I'll elaborate on them in just a moment. Whole bunch. I don't know, maybe a couple of dozen types. That some are familiar, some are not so familiar. But the Alzheimer's Association for years and years has been posting, giving the CDC the following information, that Alzheimer's disease itself, only one of several dementias, is the 6th underlying cause of death in the United States, not counting COVID. I've argued for years, no, it can't just be Alzheimer's, it should be all dementias. What is the relationship of all dementias, whether it's Alzheimer's or others, to overall cause of death? And these data are best done apples to apples, and the best way to do that for various reasons is the 2017 data for the CDC. When you look at the apples to apples comparison, dementias writ large are the number 3 underlying cause of death in the United States, second only to heart disease and cancer. Now, COVID is into that, and COVID is now the 3rd underlying cause of death in the United States. Just want to highlight, of course, suicide. When I go to Capitol Hill, my topic is always the epidemic of fatal behavioral and fatal neurological disorders. And the way you spell hope is research. You try to figure out how come this stuff is happening. You know, we're talking a lot about the opioid epidemic, and we talk a lot about the drug overdose epidemic. We need to be talking much more about the suicide epidemic. Certain groups are relatively protected compared to others, like African Americans have a markedly less suicide rate than European Americans. But boy, scary trends are happening in the African American population, as well as the trends that are occurring in other populations within this country. So I'd be remiss if I didn't comment on suicide. I sat on the board for youth suicide prevention, and some of the board members that I sat with, they themselves got involved in the problem because their kid died by suicide. And if that happened to me, I'd be in a cave the rest of my life, because how could you deal with a son? Mainly boys who died by suicide. And that's the proper term, died by suicide. You don't say killed themselves. Proper term is died by suicide. And so what I learned, these were mostly women, that they followed the existential imperative. There are some faith traditions that believe that things happen for a reason. There are other faith and non-faith traditions that don't think things happen for a reason. So we can agree to disagree on whether or not things happen for a reason. But we can all agree to the existential imperative of making reason out of the things that happen. Your loved one has Alzheimer's. Let's try to make some reason out of that. Your suicide by your young kid. Let's make some reason. And from that terrible tragedy, fight for greater good. And you do that with policy people. You do that in the community. You use your voice like some of the persons who did their legal things to talk about, being fierce advocates for persons who can't otherwise maybe take care of themselves. All right, so here's a breakdown of the most well-known of the dementias: Alzheimer's, vascular, dementia with Lewy bodies, and frontotemporal dementia. As a former head of the Virginia Brain Injury Council, I want to talk about chronic traumatic encephalopathy and not talk about it. That's largely anecdotal, and the stuff you read in the New York Times about the NFL and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, strength of evidence for that being a separate form of dementia is pretty weak, and so I put the question mark there. But there's other forms. We think that it's actually a subtype of frontotemporal dementia, but that's another story for another day. Most prevalent, of course, is Alzheimer's, and among persons who have Alzheimer's, almost 90% or more are going to have the late onset. Persons who have dementia, Alzheimer's dementia in their 50s and before the age of 65, that is a different animal altogether. In fact, some people think it literally is a different animal when you have the inheritable forms of Alzheimer's disease at a young onset, and that they may differ from the more late onset. I'm on, somebody was commenting, the Healthy Ideas Program. I'm on the advisory committee for the Virginia Center on Aging at VCU, and we pretty much have shown and are trying to push proposals for investigators to get beyond models of these early onset forms of Alzheimer's, because frankly there's not been much translation, there hasn't been a whole lot of benefit from them, trying to get better modeling for the later stage Alzheimer's disease. These models coincidentally that use, are modeling the younger forms of Alzheimer's, use transgenic mice, genetically engineered mice. And we think now, many of us, that's a good model for the early onset, but most people with Alzheimer's disease have the late onset. We need a better model for them. Vascular dementia, I want to point out, memory is oftentimes spared. So these are little strokes in the brain, vascular dementia. So memory is not an essential loss when it comes to the diagnosis of dementia. You just need, for general dementia, two of the cognitive domains that I mentioned lost. They may or may not include memory. Then I want to point out dementia with Lewy bodies. It is a standalone form of dementia, or it can occur in the end stages of Parkinson's disease. Also, interesting about that is there's dramatic fluctuations in cognition, and a good friend of mine who did a sabbatical in my lab died with Lewy body dementia, a feature of which is vivid hallucinations. And he told me, wow, there's a canary over there. Man, I can see it clear as day. I know it's not there, but man, I can see that canary clear as day. And he then was referred up to Hopkins for better treatment. And may I say very proudly, who was the neurologist that treated my friend while he was up at Hopkins? A former student of mine. And so the whole idea of multiplying out our effects by training people, it's the trainees sometimes that do a greater good than us, but setting them free is the way to go. And then the frontotemporal stuff, you don't want to be a caregiver for a person who has frontotemporal dementia. This is the real challenge of behaviors, threat to self, threat to others. These are the kinds of behaviors that really cause caregiver burnout. Nursing homes don't want these kinds of challenging behaviors, and so on. So these are real big problems. We now are shifting the research attention away from plaques and tangles towards preventative strategies, and I'll comment in detail about that in a moment. Now, let's look at be a caregiver, and coincidentally is a woman. Almost everybody in this room is a female, and it turns out something like 85%, I forgot the exact number the Alzheimer's Association states, the vast majority of caregivers for persons with dementia are women. So we're putting on a symposium, and it's going to be mentioned here a little bit later, on October 27th. It'll be online so you can get it any way you wish, shining a light on women and Alzheimer's disease. This is very much a woman's health issue that I don't think people appreciate as much as should be. Now, if you look at vascular dementia, mostly men. So not everyone is a white man. You know, some things happen more in others than in, there's all these different population demographic kinds of issues. And then frontotemporal dementia, equal opportunity pathogen, where a woman with it can be as brutal and challenging as a man with it. So sex differences are the ones I want to point out there. Or maybe gender. We've got to do more research to figure out if it's sex or gender. Now, here is the number 3 cause of overall deaths in the United States I showed you earlier. To reiterate the point, that dementia is a leading killer, a leading killer. It's just not a coincidental fact with some people. It's a major policymaker, cost of care kind of issue. This is the first person diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she had probably what we now think is the early onset. You might ask, how did Alzheimer's do his research? Well, he was a clinician for a wealthy banker. The wealthy banker died. Dr. Alzheimer's got romantically involved with the widow. Who supported Dr. Alzheimer's research? The rich widow. That was in the days before the founding of the National Institutes of Health, and shortly after the war, Second World War. Prior to that, you had to be a rich person to do research. Now people who come from the coalfields in Pennsylvania, like me, can do research thanks to the National Institutes of Health. What a wonderful resource they are. We need to defend them, push for more money, and push for more support. Now, let's look at age as a risk factor for the dementias, in this case Alzheimer's disease. As you get older, your risk goes up. Please pay attention to the highest bar. That means 35% of people that are old will have dementia, but that means almost, 70-75% don't. So we have this stereotype, because you're old, you must have dementia. Not true. Not true. Its frequency increases, but it doesn't mean because you're 107 years old, like your grandmother was, ma'am, that you're supposed to have dementia at 107. Now, here is the data on the women's health issue here. If you control for age and get rid of the idea that the people who are living longer are women, therefore that's why they have Alzheimer's. If you do the head-to-head comparisons, you see that somewhere around the middle old, around the age of 75, is when things start to pick up a little bit. But notice, if you will, as you go up to 100 years of age, there is a dramatic departure with older women, much more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's than older men. So these are women now that were well-educated and not your typical woman, but the fact of the matter is there are lots and lots of data showing women are disproportionately affected than men. What's the obvious question? Why? And who's more likely to ask that question, everything else being equal, a man or a woman? Seems to me a woman is more likely to ask the question, what's going on with this woman's health issue? And we need more women in biomedical research, and we're going to hear from somebody from UVA pretty soon who's doing research stuff. As a really old postdoc, I don't know about you. Is it you that are talking? I don't know where that person from UVA is. It took me 16 years after college to get to my final training. I did a master's degree, I did a doctoral degree, I did a postdoctoral degree, I did a research associate kind of thing. Oh God, it's tough going into research, let me tell you. And I tell students, high school kids I talked to yesterday, who say they want to go in and do neuroscience research, I say forget about it. It's easier to get an MD and then you follow it with a couple of fellowships after that. In the research arena, when it comes to getting a PhD, you got to do novel research, and sometimes that research doesn't work out, and you're in your day and night, Christmas and New Year's working on stuff. And so we still need more women in research for sure. And very importantly, as I comment on minority issues here, we clearly need more so-called underrepresented minority persons in research. So it's a women's health issue. Women more likely to get it. Women are the majority of caregivers that are out there. Question we always ask, who's taking care of the caregiver? So often, nobody is taking care of the caregiver. And what about the caregiver dealing with a care recipient who has challenging behaviors? Nobody wants that person. no nursing home wants that person, and caregivers are completely burnt out if they're dealing with terrible threat to self or threat to other kind of behaviors. Really, it's an awful problem, but dealing with the challenge behaviors associated with the dementias, and I'll comment more about that in a moment. There is our shining light on women living with dementia that will be on the web in October 27th. All right, so it is clearly not only a women's health issue, it's a minority health issue. So the Alzheimer's Association says about twice as many, as a percent of total, black persons are going to have Alzheimer's than white people, and about 1.5 as many are going to have, Hispanics are going to have it. What's the obvious question? How come? Who's more likely to ask that question? Persons of color. Do we have enough persons of color in our research and medical school environments? Short answer, no, no, and no. And how are we going to reach them? I tell kids, because I live in Hampton where Allen Iverson, the NBA basketball player, grew up, is it cool to be Allen Iverson, rich and famous, one of the best NBA players ever, or save a life? I get every kid on the block to say saving a life is cooler than shooting a hoop, except for middle school kids. Middle school kids have to process. When we see these differences, particularly with minorities and races, the first thing people genuflect at is the altered biology. So I want to dispel that myth immediately, simply by an older study that says the following. It looked at the prevalence of, I believe it was Alzheimer's disease alone, in Nigerian Africans versus the prevalence in Nigerian Americans. Presumably the gene pool is the same. Guess which group had a much greater risk of Alzheimer's disease? The Nigerian Americans. Diet, lifestyle, all that kind of stuff is really what we're thinking about, the social determinants of health rather than the biological determinants of health, particularly with racial and ethnic differences. Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project and then head of NIH, said there is no biological basis for the concept of race. What we're talking about is differential access to care, racism that's built into different systems, differential poverty rates, and so on and so forth. That brings me to CCC+, Common Law Coordinated Care. This was a demonstration grant from, I'm sorry to say if you don't like it, the Affordable Care Act. They came to Virginia, and I'm quite clear to state that Virginia at that time not at all supported the Affordable Care. Yet somehow or other, this demonstration grant was funded and done in Virginia with data-driven outcome measures. What I'm saying is shown to be beneficial. Not thought to be beneficial, but shown to be beneficial. It is a patient-centered medical home for persons who have complicated behaviors and complicated physical needs. How many in this room have heard about CCC+? Well, maybe that's okay. But how many of my academic colleagues have heard about CCC+? Hardly any. Hardly any. A evidence-based, person-centered medical home for persons with complicated issues such as Alzheimer's and osteoporosis or whatever. So put on your map to do more awareness and pursue more actively getting patients enrolled in this managed care system. Maybe that's why some of the academic docs don't like it, because some of them don't like managed care. I'm not sure, but it's pretty remarkable to me how less known it is, despite the evidence that supports it. Now I want to talk about silos. Silos are a big barrier when it comes to everything in healthcare. So we have the brain injury world competing for, before Medicaid reform, Medicaid waivers. At the same time, the Alzheimer's world was competing for those same waivers, and it was a zero-sum game. The American Brain Coalition, who's had me represent them on the Hill several times, is a coalition of these different stakeholders, not competing against each other, but playing in the sandbox together. Alzheimer's Association, National Alliance on Mental Illness, American Psychological Association, the Academy of Neurology, the psychiatry people, all in one sandbox playing together again. If you want to lift all boats, then you lift all boats by coalitions like this, instead of having a zero-sum game. Remember the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And man, we're in a zero-sum world in so many ways. Competition as opposed to cooperation. You know, right from kindergarten, we're teaching our kids to be competitive and get better grades than the other kids are getting. Right from the word go, we teach competition. We need to really paradigm shift that to cooperation. And may I just slip in, I know this is a crazy idea. We also should be teaching leadership skills, because how do you build coalitions? By asset mapping, seeing who the champions are out there. That's how you build coalitions, through leaders, through champions. Do we teach that? Are they on the SOL? Sorry, that's not on the SOL. Not on the licensing exam for my medical students, so who cares about the leadership stuff? Now, we know that about half of all residents in nursing homes have dementia. It's one of the major reasons persons are placed into nursing home facilities. I call your attention to the April 22nd report of the National Academies about the desperate state our nursing homes are in. Direct quote, "The way in which the United States finances, delivers, and regulates care in nursing home settings is ineffective, inefficient, fragmented, and unsustainable." Some of you are professional caregivers working in nursing homes. This is no shock to you. But this is a call to arms for all of us. Nobody wants to go in a nursing home. Caregivers are doing their best, the family caregivers, to keep their loved one out of the nursing home. But there are some times you just can't do it alone, and there are some times when a nursing home placement is required. But we don't want today's version of the nursing home. We want tomorrow's version of the nursing home. Now, I was honored to serve on the Dementia Services Work Group convened by the Virginia Head of Health and Human Resources a year or so ago to talk about what's happening with nursing home placements for persons with dementias who have challenging behaviors. And effectively, what was concluded was that treatment of persons with challenging behaviors due to dementia should not occur in psychiatric facilities, because it's not the same kind of behavioral problem as is depression, as is schizophrenia. It's a unique problem requiring specialized care. And so our proposals, and this is one of the few work groups I worked on, and went directly to the leadership of the House Finance Committee and the House Appropriations Center. I mean, these are direct to the policymaker kinds of things. Dementia behavioral specialists, we need many more of them formally trained, many more that are trained in dementia specialization kinds of stuff. We need more collaboration with existing programs, and that includes the development of workforce. And so VCU has a bunch of grants for workforce development that people can submit applications to, and we need more workforce development. In fact, I think today or tomorrow they're having a symposium on how to increase the workforce, particularly as related to nursing homes and so on. Need to have more outreach and awareness, and one of the things that I'm funded to do, and it'll be announced here publicly in a few weeks, is caregiver training on issues that relate to challenging behaviors, using positive behavioral controls and using crisis intervention team techniques, a whole bunch of things that we need to provide more information to for our caregivers that are out there. More respite care and crisis care programs. You don't want your loved one put into a babysitting respite care environment, even if that does free you to go out with your friends or go to the grocery store. You want your loved one in a program that is enriching to the extent possible that person, not just babysitting. And so what we need to learn here in Virginia are the lessons from the clubhouse model of respite care, started in psychiatry and now being applied to traumatic brain injury. Virginia has the largest number of brain injury clubhouses in the United States. We need to learn how they promote community and interactions and so on, and apply those best practices into respite care models for persons with dementia. But they're siloed out. You know, brain injury, that's not part of the equation, and psychiatric issues, that's not part of it. They're too much sequestered. You can look all this up in the web. It's all listed on the web. More workforce and development stuff, improved training. So the grant I'm going to tell you about in a moment is going to be training strike teams coming into nursing homes, for example, during COVID or after a disaster or tornado or whatever. We were stunned to hear that the National Guard, when they come into nursing facilities, had no training in positive behavioral controls and crisis intervention team training. So you're telling me you got advanced dementia, and here's some turkey trying to shove a swab to do a nasopharyngeal test as to whether or not you have COVID, just shoves that sucker right up your nose without any attention to the state of mind you're in and all of that. So part of our target group will be the National Guard, also the Virginia Medical Reserve Corps, the outside pharmacists, and others that we're going to be training. And there's that clubhouse model. PACE, we got to know more of PACE. You know, in the Commonwealth, you have to be on Medicaid to be eligible for reimbursement for PACE. PACE is not the same in other states. You don't have to be on Medicaid to get full reimbursement, and so we got to expand PACE because none of us wants to age in a nursing home. We all want to age in place, and there are opportunities that get beyond specific focus on the dementias and a bigger focus. Now, Western Tidewater Community Services Board, that serves pretty much all southeastern Virginia all the way up through the Middle Peninsula, was awarded through this recommendations that we made through the Dementia Services Work Group, a demonstration grant funded through a grant that Behavioral Health and Developmental Services had, to put under one roof at the same time community services boards with dementia and traumatic brain injury. I helped lead the first consensus statement in the state on what do you do with challenged behaviors in persons with traumatic brain injury, and the rule was don't send them to the community services board because those are not psychiatric, substance use, or intellectual disability stuff, not part of the mission of the CSB. Same was true with dementia. It was not part of the mission of the Community Services Board. But as a result of this workforce, now there is a demonstration grant at the Community Services Board at Tidewater Western Psychiatric for specialized treatment for persons with dementia and specialized treatment for persons who have traumatic brain injury. That's a paradigm shift. I am the biggest supporter there is of our Community Services Boards. You won't find a bigger supporter. But I can never understand the fact that they were siloed in one direction, others were siloed in a different direction. It just sure makes sense to me to put behavioral health writ large under one umbrella. Now, this is a fact too, that we end up with the brain ending up sort of like a rusty truck. And once you're in the end stages of Alzheimer's, it's real hard to put the tires back together, the hood back together, the fenders back together. It's pretty hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So the rare paradigm shift in research now is focusing on preventative strategies. And when does Alzheimer's begin? When do the other dementias begin? Decades before the symptoms present themselves. Decades. It's in those early stages that prevention is much more likely to succeed than restoration of function in advanced dementia. So that's a big paradigm shift that gets beyond the Baptist point of view that's all about amyloid beta and forget about everything else. It's producing insulin, but you have insulin resistance specific to the brain. That's a new emerging view about. There's lots of new views that are out there worth emphasizing. Now, the nursing home population, worth noting, well over half are in nursing homes because of some kind of dementia. You can't talk about nursing homes without talking about dementia. I mean, they're just one and the same to a very considerable extent. Kevorkian's first assisted suicide person was a person diagnosed in the early stages of Alzheimer's. She'd rather be dead than have Alzheimer's. We fear Alzheimer's more than death itself in many instances. Here's the fact. Again, I'm trying to drive home the point. Just because you're old does not mean you're supposed to have Alzheimer's. The majority of old people do not have the dementias or Alzheimer's. All right, this is the Lancet Commission, a very important step forward, in my opinion, about the prevention of all of the dementias we've been talking about, published a couple of years ago. Poor diet. Poor diet. Who knew? You know, if we knew, God forbid, we teach our medical students about nutrition, which we don't want to do. It's like, you know, who's the go-to in your communities on nutrition? Don't go to the MDs or the DOs. You go to the registered dietitians. There's the one. That's their business. They know what they're talking about. Many of the classically trained physicians out there are clues for the most part. Physical inactivity, a sedentary lifestyle. So get moving. Does that mean you got to have some fancy bike that costs you, a stationary bike that costs you $5,000 in your house? No. I call back to the diabetes prevention trial a generation ago. They simply asked people at risk for diabetes to do two things. Walk 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And watch what you eat. If you're going to go for a Snickers bar, get an apple. Those persons at risk for diabetes, including Pima Indians on the far southwest, tremendous increased risk, who followed that simple lifestyle approach, dramatically reduced the conversion of prediabetes into diabetes. So you don't have to exercise like crazy. And you know, if you're not motivated, get yourself a dog or something to just get you out walking a little bit. But a little bit of exercise is a good thing, and a healthy diet. Persons who are less educated are persons that have an increased risk. Now, does that mean my dad, who had an 8th grade education and had to quit school to work in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, had less neurons to begin with? No, I don't think so. But it is a barrier when you have less education as far as access to lots of different things. Improving cognitive stimulation and education is another approach. The human brain is a social brain. We cannot be alone. How many caregivers are alone and isolated? How many care recipients are alone and isolated? We are not supposed to be alone. And I'm not talking about friends on the internet, quote unquote friends. I'm talking about real people breathing the same air that you breathe in. That's the way to do this. See, depression. Depression is a risk factor for dementias. Again, how could the CSB simply focus on serious mental illness and substance use disorders and not, back in the day, also consider dementia? Because they're incestuously related. Incestuously related. And among others, look at air pollution. And which groups of persons are more likely to be closer to the coal deposits and some of the neighborhoods that have pretty poor quality air? Some of those, lots of those people are poor persons. And so air pollution's been identified as a risk factor, and alcohol. Remember, the Mediterranean diet says eat a whole bunch of different things that we'll comment on here in a moment, and have one small juice glass worth of wine every day. Do not do that as far as the Mediterranean diet. You drink water. Do not drink alcohol. Alcohol, older persons on multiple medications particularly, is bad news. So the Mediterranean diet, as recommended now, should not include alcohol. Should not include alcohol. And then COVID. I've done some presentations on COVID. In my opinion, and there's growing evidence that COVID is now a risk factor for subsequent dementias. And what we're seeing in long-haul COVID is brain fog as one of its features. That's a type of mild cognitive impairment. Mild cognitive impairment is a major risk factor, for example, for the Alzheimer's disease. And so what I'm saying is the COVID thing, I predict, and many others are predicting, going to increase the prevalence of the dementias down the road until we get this thing figured out. Okay, the MIND diet. This is all the rage. Not the Mediterranean diet, the MIND diet. Mediterranean diet plus the DASH diet. The Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet separately were originally evaluated for protection against hypertension and heart disease, and now there's this combination. It has elements of both diets, except unlike the Mediterranean diet, which is not only increasing your vegetables a lot, this diet is not increasing fruits as much as the typical Mediterranean and the typical DASH diet. They're emphasizing things like green leafy vegetables. Not everybody likes spinach, coincidentally, but hey, you can look for excuses, and I don't particularly like spinach, so I just take tons and tons of parsley as an example. Hey, it's green, it's kind of leafy. I don't know what the difference is, but if you can't eat and don't like spinach, there are alternative ways to go after that. And there are also some suggested benefits in Parkinson's disease. That's another silo. Parkinson's world versus the Alzheimer's world. They have a lot in common, but the twain very often don't meet. So I'm going to give you, there's the MIND diet right there, in simple-minded terms. How much you should eat of what. And instead of doing servings, are you ready for this? I'm using fists. I'm using the fist the size of your hand, so you don't have to say, what the heck is one serving or another serving. I guess this is going to be on the web, and you'll be able to access this. And I'm going to send to Ellen hard copies of this if you want to get it. But basically, we're talking about something that involves vegetables, grains, fish, chicken. And when I say chicken, I don't mean fried chicken. I mean sauteed chicken. Oh, there's a million ways to cook chicken. You know, I'm getting hungry thinking about it. Naturally, it has to be in olive oil with tons and tons of garlic. You know, I'm really getting hungry now thinking about it. Not fried chicken. No. That's part of the equation. They're talking about a fistful, a handful of berries twice a day. Blueberries, or whatever kind of berries you want. And they're talking about basically a handful of whole grains. Some of these cereals you buy in the shopping market and stuff, twice a day. And, you know, there's some other things that are here, like legumes and things. Remember, beans are the legumes that we're talking about, but green beans are not legumes. They're not legumes. And so whenever I can, even with my spaghetti, I'm going to put in some legumes, and we call it in Italian, my mother was Italian, a pasta fazool. So, hey, put some of these white beans or whatever into your spaghetti. So I look for excuses to put these things in as best I can.
Yes.
Now, this is a study that I think is really important, the Lyon Heart Guide study. It's an atypical Mediterranean diet. They don't use olive oil, they use canola oil. They don't eat more fish. They instead get their omega-3 fatty acids through canola oil. They don't drink more alcohol, as is the case of the typical Mediterranean diet. It's an atypical Mediterranean diet. And in a study done several years ago in persons with existing heart disease to see if they could prevent a secondary occurrence of it, they showed that this diet reduced by almost 70% any kind of cardiac event, whether it was fatal or not fatal, compared to a so-called prudent Western diet. As soon as that thing was published, I contacted the investigator in France and I said, let's do this study except focus on Alzheimer's disease. But this is a real hardcore nutrition thing, and they actually had nutrition diaries and collected all this data. He effectively told me it would kill him if he had to do this again. It was so hard, and no way was he going to do it. So I've been hoping we could get a randomized trial because compared to the typical Mediterranean diet, I think this is, sorry for being a baby boomer, the bomb. But there's not the evidence-based medicine to support that. That's a hypothesis I'd like to see tested. Okay. Now, the multi-domain lifestyle approach is something I want to comment on briefly. Should you eat a good diet? Or should you exercise? Or should you be socially engaged? Or should you cognitively exercise? The answer is no, 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 no. Yes, 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 and then you do them all. Do them all at the same time. And so the behavioral domains that are now under a clinical trial investigation to try and replicate a profound study done in Finland are physical exercise, good nutrition, cognitive exercise, and social engagement. At the same time, you watch your blood pressure and those kinds of things. They showed improvement in cognitive scores. This is the major focus right now of research in nutrition as related to the dementia. So the mind diet combined with moderate exercise, combined with cognitive stimulating activities, and combined with increased social engagement. Now, let's ask this question. The study that is being funded by the Alzheimer's Association to replicate this multi-domain thing, it only costs $20 million. See how expensive things are? Without money, you can't do research. The Alzheimer's Association can't do what it's trying to do without more funding. Can't get all your funding from NIH. You got to get it from other sources. $20 million to do this so-called pointer study here. It's not for amateurs. Let me just tell you. You got to have the resources to do this kind of thing. Now, how do you exercise? Oh, I don't like being on a treadmill. Oh, I don't like walking the dog. Well, how about dancing? What a cool way it is to exercise by just simply dancing. Or how about social engagement? Do you have to have some prescribed kind of thing? Or can you just get involved with people doing different things? Elizabeth and I were talking a little bit earlier over lunch, a crochet club. Just get together with people and do whatever it is. God forbid, get together with people and play with Legos if you want. Just do something with other people as a way of promoting social engagement. Nursing homes. We want to prevent this rusty truck because once it gets all busted, we're not going to put it back together again. The emphasis now is on prevention, not on restoration. Now, let's end this very quickly on positive behavioral controls for challenging behaviors. Major cause of professional caregiver burnout and major cause of family caregiver turnout. And so there's a study by Watt et al. That argued non-pharmacological interventions for challenging behaviors are more effective than psychiatric interventions by way of medications. What's the first instinct when somebody's acting out from a clinical point of view? Dope them up. Pharmacologically restrain them. Yep. And remember, pharmacological restraints are highly restrictive environments. The Olmsted decision of the Supreme Court said people should be in the least restrictive environment. The National Task Force on Dementia Care said we need to dramatically reduce the use of antipsychotics in dealing with people who have challenged behavior. So what are you going to do as an alternative? Positive behavioral controls and crisis intervention techniques. There's a bunch of other things that are here. We're publishing on computer engagement stuff. The world of art and medicine needs many more well-powered randomized controlled trials to prove that their predictions work. The Lego world seems to me, ma'am, needs a randomized controlled trial. Maybe there is one out there, but we need a big one.
Yes, sir.
To have proof of concept for sure.
Okay.
Lots of different things. And did you know? So people will say in the homeless world, well, we can't deal with people with advanced dementia. That's not part of our deal. But we have precursors to cognitive impairment right on our streets, everywhere, right around our corner, under our noses. And there's significant risk of cognitive impairment like psychiatric and substance abuse issues for dementia because they're all incestuously related. Now, let's talk about the state psychiatric facilities. Repeat what I said earlier. Not suited for persons who have challenging behaviors. More expensive, least effective. You want to change policymakers? Give them dollars and cents. Way more expensive to put a person with challenging behaviors with the dementias in a psychiatric facility than into a dedicated specialized treatment program. Much more effective. And hence the Western Tidewater Community Services Board pilot. Hopefully that's going to have evidence-based data to support this throughout the rest of the state. Now, this is what stimulated the grant that I'm going to mention here just briefly. I saw on NPR this story about the New Jersey Department of Health evacuating persons from a long-term care facility early in the COVID epidemic. Now imagine that woman on that wheelchair having dementia with the New Jersey Health Department suited up in all these hazmat stuff. She surely would have thought she was being abducted by aliens. I saw no evidence of positive behavioral control by way of the New Jersey Health Department. I said, my God, this is just awful. And I said, we got to do something about this. And so the CDC funding that I got, $829,000, it'll be announced in a few weeks, will talk about how we train people in our nursing facilities to deal with the challenging behaviors in a better way using positive behavioral controls, and how do we help them during disasters. You know, we don't want to evacuate a nursing facility at all costs, but man, there's a tornado, there's something, there's going to be an instance here in Virginia, sooner than later, we're going to have to evacuate a nursing home, and I'm sorry, these strike force people are not well trained, and so we're going to try to do a couple of things. Number one, who are the boots on the ground in nursing home patient care? 85% of the hands-on care in nursing homes are certified nurse assistants. They are paid poorly. They have all kinds of social determinants of health issues that impact them. They're not getting paid appropriately. They're not getting, they got to work in multiple facilities, deal with the multiple contagions of one type or another. The boots on the ground are certified nurse assistants. We were below threshold level before COVID. Now we're like way beyond that. So how could we improve the quality of life of our certified nurse assistants? Well, the nursing home recommendations that National Academies state have a number of recommendations, but I want to add something else. We're proposing a mental health ambassador program. We're proposing that every nursing facility that we can fund will have one mental health ambassador who is certified in mental health first aid. It's an 8-hour course. It's not all that hard. It takes 8 hours. And so we're going to try to fund certified nurse assistants released activity to do this mental health first aid, the Mental Health America's program that is validated by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. So they can serve as mental health ambassadors and know the signs of other people who are under distress, know the signs of themselves being under distress, and very importantly, reduce the stigma against seeking help for mental illness. So that's one part. The other part is focusing on the strike team people, and we're partnering with Virginia's Home for Public Media, VPM in Richmond, has all of these amazing things. If you haven't seen their Alzheimer's thing that went national, it's just a fabulous program. But what we're doing is we're going to form videos, training videos, specifically geared for these strike team members and nursing home people. But we're going to make sure they're lay-oriented enough so that family caregivers and others will also be able to take them off of YouTube and learn about how you divert somebody from an event that could be deadly. Police officers are trained, not all, but some, and what do you do if the person with schizophrenia is coming at you with a baseball bat? Do you shoot them or do you use positive behavioral controls to divert their attention and so on? So that's what this grant's going to do in partnership with our standardized patient program at Eastern Virginia Medical School. It's going to be a really cool and fun thing, and we're forming a statewide advisory committee for experts on the different pathologies that cause challenging behaviors to help make sure we go in the right direction instead of the wrong direction. Now, the arts. I'm a fierce supporter of the arts. One of the Congressional Caucus programs I went to was a program sponsored by the Congressional STEAM Caucus. As a 35-year professor at Eastern Virginia Medical School, I am completely opposed to STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, without the arts. STEAM education is where I'm at. And boy, that's second-class citizens. You know, the art therapy people, music therapy people, recreational music people are kind of poo-pooed by the rest of the world in general. Tell me a nursing facility, even a one-star facility, that doesn't have the therapeutic rec people having people sing. I mean, why are they doing that if there's not something beneficial to it? So the arts in general. And they are going to fire some of the structures that are identified here, known as the salience network. I don't care that you know the name of those structures, but I want you to know those structures are relatively preserved even in the end stages of dementia. They're there waiting to be fired by meaningful stimuli. Now, a meaningful stimulus could be a stranger is in the shower with you. Stranger happens to be your spouse, but the stranger's in the shower with you, going to hurt you. That's one negative way to fire it. Or the therapeutic arts, or the recreational arts. Maslow says the pinnacle of being a person is creative expression. We need to give more creative expression to persons who are in advanced dementia. Look at, for example, the Art in the Making program of the Alzheimer's Association, the beautiful stuff that persons with advanced dementia have. And so I think that one way to fire the salience network is, for example, familiar music. These are parts, I don't care that you know the details of this, but these are the same structures. Familiar music fires the salience network and is waiting to be fired. Has to be familiar music, though, and so this one is alive inside. This guy was a religious person who grew up with a particular group of religious songs. Religious songs were very meaningful to him. When not played, he was very somnolent in a wheelchair. As soon as that music came on, he was moving and grooving. Now, that's an anecdotal report, but the idea here is the salience network is waiting to be fired too often in negative ways. How about we start thinking about positive ways to fire that by embracing the artists in our communities who are out there trying to do good, volunteering in nursing facilities, by getting more training for the therapeutic recs that are out there, and by fully embracing art and medicine in general. Now, I'm done. I want you as caregivers, or if you potentially are a care recipient, to do the following. This is the old Gaelic saying: dance as if no one is watching, and sing as if no one can hear. You got to celebrate yourself. You look for the greatness that is inside you. You look for the greatness that is inside of the person with dementia, and you celebrate the humanity that you each share together. Do you understand the power of touch? I'm not talking about the healing power of touch where you approach a hand and vibes go through it and things happen. I don't know about the validity of that. I'm just talking about holding the hand of somebody suffering from the advanced dementias. Powerful thing. I think caregivers generally know if they're not able to get through, they just hold each other. What a wonderfully profound thing it is to just touch another person. Look for greatness and look for in yourself and others. And don't forget Rosalind Carter. 4 kinds of people on earth. Those who were caregivers, those who are caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need a caregiver. 4 people on earth. And so we need to empower caregivers. And may I say, I'm very involved with military, and I'm on the governor's challenge to prevent suicide and military invasion. I'm very involved with them. We always say thank you for your service. Let me say to the care providers here, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Thank you. So Ellen's going to throw a hook at me here, but quickly ask me something if you want.
Yeah, questions?
Okay, so back on the slide, you were talking about dementia with Lewy bodies, with the fluctuating cognition within a year of Parkinson's symptoms. and with the hallucinations, I'm wondering, is that in the progressive stage or the advanced stage?
That's more of the advanced stage.
Okay.
And they don't present with typical Parkinson's stuff. They have this hunched over gait, shuffling gait, usually not the tremor, not the other features of Alzheimer's. It's a different thing than Alzheimer's.
Okay.
But they have this stuff called alpha-synuclein, which is this clump of proteins. They share that, and they're called Lewy bodies. That's why the name Lewy bodies.
Thank you.
It was very interesting. Dementia seeds, I'm just reading it.
Boy, you must be really quick on your hands.
Yeah.
My poor medical students, they just write their arms off when I'm speaking.
But it was fascinating, so that's why I was trying to capture things. But anyway, dementia, seeds planted by adverse childhood events. And then you...
So we need to test that out.
Oh,
but it is a
all right.
reasonable prediction that the stress of domestic abuse, the stress of poverty, and so on, is going to increase the risk of all kinds of bad things, including the dementias.
Well, you mentioned it changes gene expression.
Yeah, that's called
What is that?
epigenetics. So we know if you change a gene that it'll affect behavior. But what people don't know, as well as they should, is vice versa. Behavior, in turn, changes gene expression. And so what's exercise do? It changes gene expression. What does, stress, the stresses of life do? Changes gene expression. And those changes in gene expression outside the genome, caused by things like behavior, can cause permanent changes. That's called an epigenetic change. And now you get one epigenetic change, another one, and pretty soon you're going to reach a threshold, is what we're looking at here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does vinegar in the diet have anything to do with dementia?
Say again now about diet.
Vinegar.
Vinegar.
Daily vinegar have anything to do with...
Well, if we start getting into individual dietary components that Americans use because Prevention Magazine says they might be good or not, we could be here another 40 days and 40 nights. So I don't know what the evidence-based literature is on vinegar, except to say I do know what it is on Coca-Cola. And so, frankly, I'd rather have been drinking vinegar than Coca-Cola. But otherwise, I don't know.
Yeah.
The other day I was looking at the news and I just came across it and they said there was new research that Alzheimer's was an autoimmune. There's new research and I didn't know. They didn't elaborate.
Well, I was a consultant for ABC News for a long time on breaking studies in Alzheimer's research. And boy, there are a lot of these things that get put out that are not well validated and so on.
Yeah.
Is there an autoimmune component to it? I suppose it's possible, but I didn't hear that particular
Yeah, it was a
report.
couple of days ago I was just watching news.
Yeah, I was probably watching Seinfeld reruns instead, so.
I'm sure that diet and exercise and all those things can help prevent lots of things,
Sure.
as well as dementia. But it's difficult to determine which things to actually go by because everyone has their research and everyone has...
Yes, I agree. And so these dietary guidelines come out of the U.S. dietary guidelines, which are the ones that I think we should be focused on mostly. And they're coming out of the data-driven stuff that is associated with Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. And they're not based on one trial. They're based on multiple trials, which we talk about gives added strength of evidence. The strength of evidence for vinegar and autoimmunity, that's not there. So these are diets based on good strength of evidence. So when you hear new cure from Alzheimer's disease in fruit flies, to me you got to say, maybe down the road, but I'm not so sure right now, okay?
Well, where do you look, though? I mean, do you look at...
Look at the MIND diet. Look at the Alzheimer's, go to the Alzheimer's Association, and they'll have the MIND diet there for you. Now, is that the only diet, the best diet? I think there are other ways. I said the Leonhardt diet, I think, is potentially promising. But you want to go on data-driven decision-making because you're not a politician. Politicians are going to go, it's on the right or it's on the left. We don't want opinions. We want data-driven decision-making.
So with like NIH NIH research and...
Yeah, NIH, Alzheimer's stuff, validated stuff, not just something reported on the web that, I don't know, peanut butter is the next cure for frontotemporal dementia. Though let me just say this about peanuts. We live in the peanut capital of the world, Virginia and General Hampton Roads in particular, and I have funding from this group called the Birdsong Foundation, and they made their money from shelling peanuts. You know, planters want the peanuts, they don't want the shells. Now, stay with me here. And don't be like my dean who gets glassy-eyed when I tell him about this. They throw away the shells, and so basically they sell it like for stuff that you put on the ground and stuff like that. It's basically trash. But in the peanut shells is the new thing in aging, and that's resveratrol. Sounds like Geritol. Is that the key to successful aging? No, but Americans want to believe there's one thing and only one thing. You just pop this resveratrol and boom, it's going to make you happy as a clam. But what does the Birdsong Foundation do with all that peanut shell stuff? They get rid of it. When they could partner with my med school, extract the resveratrol, sell it to Americans who just think it's going to be the bomb, and make a whole bunch of money to support our geriatrics program and some of our other fellowship programs. So that's my take on peanuts as related to Alzheimer's disease.
Let's take one more question for Dr. Aravich. One last question.
With dementia,
Let me just say this. I love a creative and active brain. The more questions, the better.
Okay.
I'm giving you a positive behavioral control high five.
Thank you. I just didn't want to take someone else's time for a question. No, with dementia, and understand the brain is dying. So with the fact that the brain is dying, I'm trying to wrestle dementia and depression. Is the fact that the brain...
Two of the three Ds.
The fact that the brain is dying cause depression, or is it...
Oh, the chicken and the egg question. Oh, that's a crazy one. Yeah, and that's the issue with the amyloid plaques. Are they a cause or are they consequence? It keeps us up at night. Is it the chicken or the egg? Depression is a risk factor, but is that the early sign of Alzheimer's disease when it occurred? Short answer is we need more research to figure it out. But they are related. Now, let me just leave you with this. My kid was born in 1989. I want to make the point that correlation does not prove causation. There are 4 interpretations of my kid born in 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Interpretation number 1, his birth caused the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Interpretation number 2, the collapse of the Berlin Wall caused the birth of my kid. Correlation number 3 interpretation is the way the sun, the moon, and Jupiter were aligned caused both of those things to happen. And number 4, just as equally plausible, is there a coincidence. And so correlation does not prove causation, is what I'm trying to say.
Wow.